Point like this so far away from anything?
Well, I'll tell you about that.
Okay.
You probably would.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I discuss just about everything that there is for the most part to discuss. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions, and I pretty much answer about it. So you get a little bit better understanding of it. Alright guys, so a couple things before we really get started on this tour. First off, they wanted to keep this place as historically accurate as possible. So as we're touring through here, you're going to find there's not a whole lot of handrails and guardrails, as in none. So just be safe while you're traveling around. There's a lot of unfinished construction, a lot of trip hazards around, so watch your footing, watch where you step in. Those open embrasures, the big open holes there on the second level there, when you start looking out through those holes, don't go leaning up against that wall to get a closer look at anything. Close look you're going to get is head first diving in the boat with a brick in your hand, so just brick around that area. So just be real careful, be real safe, guys. Another thing, you guys are going to have a lot of questions. I can understand that, everyone always does. I also find that I answer about 90% of these questions on the tour throughout the duration of my tour. So if you can try to hold those questions until, say, when we're walking from point to point, I can answer a few questions between those points as well, for sure. Or even try to hold them until the end. If it's a general knowledge question about the place, I'll almost guarantee I'm going to answer the question on it. Otherwise, at the very end, I will answer questions at that point. Now, if you do have one that's just like eating you up and you got to get it off your chest, by all means, guys, throw it at me. I do not want to have you stressed out over this tour, so throw those at me and I'll answer them for you. So another thing is, guys, you are more than welcome to leave this tour whenever you want to. It's not that big a deal. The only thing that I ask is please do not all leave at once. It just makes it rough on me. So. That being said, guys, we're going to get started on the tour here. So the area out here was discovered back in 1513 by a man of the name of Don Juan Ponce de Leon. Now, it's the first documented discovery that we're aware of course. When he discovered the area, he charted 11 islands. Now, there are only 7 islands left. 4 of them have been reclaimed by the sea. Like I said on the boat, the last one being Bird Key in the 1930s. And all that being said, I also want to put your minds at ease right now. You're not going to come across any grave sites on this island. You're not going to go finding anything while you're snorkeling out there either. Most of the burial grounds were all on Bird Key and other islands that have actually disappeared now, but the government had actually relocated those graves to the mainland and other locations. So we'll answer that question right off the bat and get that out of the way. Now, when Don Juan Ponce de Leon first charted this area, he called the area Las Tortugas, which means the turtles. And the reason for this is the abundant amount of sea turtles that he harvested out here. Now, by harvested, these guys needed a protein supply. They don't have any refrigeration, so they need a protein supply that's going to keep. And they find that in the sea turtle. You take a sea turtle and you flip it over on its back, it's not going anywhere. You splash it with salt water, sea turtles stay alive that way for up to a month. Now, that is not very humane, of course, I understand this, but they don't have any organizations like PETA and stuff like that back in that time, so they don't have to worry about that stuff. They stack them up on top of each other that way and tie them off to the decks that way. And then they have a protein supply in that sense. So they harvested 160 sea turtles out here when they first came out into the area. So that's how I got Las Tortugas, the turtle name. Now, dry is added in the 18th century. In the 18th century, British map makers added dry to the name because they didn't want anyone thinking there was a fresh water source out here. The only fresh water you're going to come across out here is if you collect under 30 inches of rainfall in a year. So that's the name Dry Tortugas. So now our interest in the area doesn't come around until 1803. In 1803, we make a sizable land purchase, the Louisiana Purchase. Doubles our land mass, but also gives us the Mississippi River. Great trade and commerce route. Merchants can come down through that area, dumps them into the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico has a great little thing called the Gulf Stream. Gulf Stream's a nice little current. It's kind of like a conveyor belt, a escalator belt, you know, like the little walkways inside airports, for sailing ships. They can get into that current and it takes them down south, shoots them out to the east, around the tip of Florida and up the eastern coastline at a faster rate than sailing itself. So Along that stretch, though, there's only one set of harbors, and that's the harbors out of this island right here. So that's where the importance of this land comes into play for us. Now, we can't do anything with this area out here, of course, because we don't own it. Spain owns this land. They own the Tortugas and Florida, for that matter. So there's not a whole lot we can do with it until 1821. In 1821, Spain decides they have some family debts that need to be settled, and these family debts are in the sum of about $5 billion. So the agreement that we reach is debts are wiped clean, we get Florida and the Tortugas. So that happens in 1821. Now between 1821 and 1823, we do what we can for eradicating piracy through that time. And then between that same time and 1826, the construction and completion of the first structure happens out here. That's a lighthouse that's set on a round pad over here, right behind these two sets of trees back here. It's a 65-foot tall lighthouse. It was built by the Lighthouse Council, otherwise known today as the Coast Guard. Now, you guys are probably wondering, first off, why is there a fort out in the middle of nowhere? So we'll start there with this. First off, the United States starts building forts like this in 1797, mainly because we don't have a blue water navy. Blue water navy is one like the British colony or the British countries have. They have these large vessels and large fleets of these vessels that can make their way across the Atlantic. We don't have anything that can rival these naval fleets that they have, and that's what we consider a blue water navy. And since we don't have any fleets like this, we need to build coastal forts, these army coastal forts like this, to protect the coastline. This became more evident in 1812 when the British sailed up to the shoreline and burnt Washington, D.C. to the ground. So this fort here was built during the third stage of fort building. There were some 42 forts that were built during that stage, a lot of them down the east coast and through the Gulf area, and a couple down the west coast area too. So the reason, now the original reason for this fort, the original reason for building out here came from one of the first generals to visit out in the area. He wanted to try to construct a fort out here to set up a naval operation so that we had a staging ground out here for a naval fleet so that they can control the flow of traffic through the Gulf. But when he got to the area, he looked at the island and decided that this is not a very good area to build. It's just a bunch of flat, low-lying islands that didn't have a whole lot to offer. So that kind of nixed that idea. Another general came along after him and said, on the contrary, this is not an area that's not worthy of being built upon. We could build a fort out there. And the reason for building the fort out there this time was the merchant vessels coming down through the Gulf Stream. See, they don't have any naval fleets to actually protect them, and they need some sort of protection along the way from anybody trying to hijack or intercept these merchant lines. So that's where this fort comes into play. These merchant vessels can come down through there, and instead of having these supply lines disrupted, they'll actually can take safe refuge around the outside of this fort here, and fall under the protection of the cannons on this fort. So that's the main reason for this fort being out here. Furthermore, if we were not to build on this land, we leave it open for somebody else to build on, which would be, say, the British or French could build a staging ground here for attacking those supply lines, or even attacking the coastline of the United States. So another reason I'm building out here in the first place. Now, also looking around, you're probably wondering, this place is huge. Why would you need to build such a huge fort on top of that? The reason for this is, again, no blue water navy. You don't have a blue water navy, no one's coming to help you out if this place goes under siege. So if this place goes under siege, you have to withstand a siege for some time, and they figured on about a year. So if you have to withstand a siege for a year, you need provisions for that time, which means gunpowders, guns, cannons, cannonballs, food, water, all of this stuff for up to a year. That's where this 8 acres of parade ground comes into play. You can store all that stuff right inside here for that time frame. There was some 1,700 troops stationed out here at the height of this place. 300 more family members of some of these troops. So there were 2,000 people out here at one time. That's a lot of people out here to have to supply provisions for, too. So they start construction on this fort in 1846. Now, construction starts in a time where the country is united. Everyone is happy with each other, and everything's going just fine. And during that time, we're getting all these bricks coming in from Pensacola, Florida. Now, this goes on until 1861, and in 1861 then the Civil War breaks out. When the Civil War breaks out, you now have Pensacola, Florida turns into a Confederate state, a Southern territory. This fort remains in Union control, so it's a Union fort. You're not going to get those bricks from Pensacola, Florida anymore. Now the Union has to go 1,400 miles to the north to get these bricks, Brewer, Maine. Packs on a tremendous amount of length on that trip, but that's also where the two different tones of brick color come into play. The lower lighter color ones, those are all sun-dried bricks from Pensacola, Florida. Get rid of that guy. The ones on the top, the red-colored ones, are all fire-dried bricks from Brewer, Maine. All the granite you see around out here all came from the Vermont, Maine area there. It was cut off-site, measured here, cut off-site, and pieced into place when it was brought down. So when you walk around this fort, you're going to look at some of the masonry work on this fort, and just look at the kind of craftsmanship that went into this fort. This place has been out here for a number of years, about 150, 160, 170 years or so. Quite some time that this fort's been out here, and it's still in pretty great shape for that kind of time frame on it without having a whole lot of maintenance done to it throughout those times. That's because of craftsmanship, the quality of craftsmanship that went into it too. When this thing shifts, and it did shift, it shifts all together. You got that 8-foot thick, 45-foot tall curtain wall that binds that whole wall together. So when you have any shifting going on, the whole thing shifts together. Now, the shifting and settling of this fort became a big issue with the fort. The Army Corps of Engineers had a first-time feat that they had to come up with, that they had to work with out here, and that was the first sub-sea level foundation building that they had to put into place out here. They had built down and put filters into place that they had felt that they were on good solid ground for, but they realized then that they didn't actually go down to bedrock and into solid ground. But this thing actually did settle down a foot, which caused a tremendous amount of issues, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the tour. But construction goes on with this fort starting in 1846. It actually goes on until 1875. Now, this lighthouse over here during that time was the main lighthouse out here for up until about 1874. At that point, it got damaged by a storm, and instead of rebuilding it, they just reverted over to the Loggerhead Lighthouse. That lighthouse was built in 1858, so it was already up and operational. They just decided to use it as a main lighthouse out here. There's another lighthouse up on top of this bastion right there, and that's actually a harbor light. That one just basically kind of gives you a reference to the harbor location out here. So just gives you an idea of the location of it. So that's made out of boilerplate iron. The reason for that being built out of boilerplate iron is if this fort were to ever be attacked and cannonballs would careen off of a brick harbor light up there, it would send brick shrapnel raining down on the men down inside the fort, causing a lot of damage to these guys. So the boilerplate iron is a lot more structurally sound, and it won't send all that shrapnel down in that regard. So that's the reason for that. And that one was actually built a lot later as well. It was actually built after 1874. So the main bulk of the construction of this fort takes place between 1846 and 1875. Now it was never finished during that time, and that's all because a few things of red tape from Washington slowed it down a lot, but also the settling was the biggest issue with this fort. It caused so much trouble that they had to stop construction on it because they had to try to figure out the weight situation with it. So, but the Army was the ones that manned it throughout that time. Towards the end of the Army station out here, they used it as a quarantine facility. So they would bring soldiers from foreign wars in here and quarantine them here for a couple of weeks, just to make sure they didn't have any foreign and exotic diseases to bring back to the mainland. Then the Army actually abandoned it at that point. The Merchant Marines took it over and utilized it for the same reason, for a quarantine facility. And then after the Marines abandoned it, the Merchant Marines abandoned it, and the Navy took it over. The Navy's the ones that built the coaling docks out there. They built coaling docks so they could store large reserves of coal out there for vessels like the USS Maine and such. They could actually use this area as a refueling station. Gives them another 70 miles worth of reach out into this area. So. And then, of course, after the Navy utilized it for a while, they then abandoned it. And it remained abandoned for a number of years until, upon its rediscovery, it was noted about the place out here. Then in 1935, it was turned into a national monument. And the reason for it being turned into a national monument was to recognize the ecological importance of this area. See, the third largest barrier reef in the world starts right out here, the Dry Tortugas. It begins in the Dry Tortugas and stretches all the way up to Biscayne Bay. The only two larger are the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and the reef that goes around the outside of Belize. So this one being the third largest. Now, with this one being so remote, you have a very healthy reef out here. Now, unfortunately, we don't have access to that reef because it's further off to the south of us right now, and we are actually limited to the use of this island right here, Garden Key. So it's unfortunate we can't utilize that to come to that area right there. If you were to bring yourself out of a private vessel, though, you couldn't actually go out to that reef area and check it out. So it's a national monument from 1935 all the way up until 1992. And then in 1992, President Bush Sr. actually names it a national park. And he does this to recognize not only the ecological importance of the area, but also the historical value of this fort as well. So it's been a national park since then. So let's see. Basically, my idea, guys, is I'm going to walk you guys through this fort. I want to go ahead and go through this fort, point out structures to you guys, and tell you about the use of them, what they were here for, and that sort of thing. So, first off, though, does anyone know what the uniforms were made out of back then? Wool. Wool. They were made out of wool. These guys actually were required to wear these uniforms too. So you can imagine, like right now we're in spring. In the summertime, the wind that we have, this little breeze that we have going on, that dies down even more, and then it's a blistering heat of 90, 95 degrees out here, plus a lot more humidity. So these guys, for that reason, you have this raised foundation back here. That's the infantry barracks back there. Across the way, there's another raised foundation that's very similar to it, and that's the officers' quarters. Both of these structures were built up taller than the curtain wall. And the reason for that was to utilize the breeze that comes over the top of that curtain wall. Very nice. I think it's a little fish there. Finch there. Yeah. So, this never panned out for them, though. They were going to utilize that breeze for ventilation on those buildings, but never panned out because it just didn't give a very good ventilation in those buildings. And because of this, all these guys ended up staying up on the second level. The reason for that is those large openings you see up there have always been that way. They never finished the construction because of the settling issue that they had here. So it's always been a large overhold up there. When you have a roof over your head still, but it also creates a nice wind tunnel up there, so it makes it one of the most comfortable spots in the fort out here. And we may get a good feeling of that today. With the wind coming through this angle, we might get a good little wind tunnel feel down from where we plan on getting up on top there. So right now, guys, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go across this area. Yes, ma'am.
So are we going to go to the top end of the building?
Yeah, we're going to make our way across here. I'm going to set up in the middle of this parade ground and tell you about a few more buildings.